Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is John McKinney, and I am currently serving as the Minority Leader of the Connecticut State Senate, and proud to be in my 12th year representing Fairfield in the State Senate. With me tonight is Representative Tony Hwang. Also, we have Brenda Kupchick running for State Representative, DeeDee Brandt running for State Representative, and our very own Judge of Probate, Dan Caruso. Hello, Dan.
Hello, Senator.
We know everyone is busy, and the reality of the world we're living in is that struggling as well with our economic recession of the past couple of years. And we feel it's important, as candidates who've put our names on the ballot, to have a conversation with the people we represent and want to represent in the future about what is happening in the state of Connecticut, the fiscal crisis we face, the economic crisis we face together. Republicans, Democrats, Independents, we're all in the same boat together, and we need to all be working together to get ourselves out of it. What we've put together tonight is a very short PowerPoint proposal, just to give you some basic facts and figures about our state budget, the difficulties we face. Obviously, there are a host of facts and figures we could present. We've tried to condense them down to just some of the more relevant and important ones to give you a framework for where we are. And again, many of these could be seen in different lights by opposing views, but what you're presented here is not anything other than factual information that's been provided from the Office of Fiscal Analysis in our state legislature. That is a nonpartisan group of what we have here. So the first slide, if we can get to it, just in terms of historical purposes, and this one actually was done by the Yankee Institute for Public Policy, just to show you that starting in 1971-72, all the way to 2007 and 2008. So this figure runs to 2008, and it is adjusted for inflation for $2008. The blue line represents our population, and the red line represents our real spending in the state of Connecticut. And again, just to show you that while our population has remained flat, and we've even lost a few, one of the only or one of two states to actually lose population, we've seen an incredible growth in state spending. Now, while you would probably tend to see some growth in state spending as you have inflation and cost of living increases, one could question what is it with the same number of people that requires so much more money to service the people of the state of Connecticut. The second slide shows you what our budget deficit projections are for the state of Connecticut. Now, we are currently in, the first number there is FY 2011. That's the fiscal year that we are currently in. Our fiscal years run from July 1st to June 30th. So July 1st, 2010 started our 2011 fiscal year. And we are currently looking at a significantly smaller budget deficit in this current year. One note, though, the number there does not reflect some assumptions that were made in the budget which have yet to be realized. And two of those are $50 million in government efficiencies that are supposed to materialize from recommendations made by a task force, which is yet to make those recommendations. And the other is over $200 million in what was anticipated as a second round of federal stimulus money from the federal government, which also has not occurred. So that deficit in our current year could be even larger by as much as about $300 million. Then you look at 2012, 2013, and 2014, and reality hits. You are looking at a $3 billion budget deficit in each of the next 3 fiscal years. So this is not a short-term problem. And the slide, which we'll have later, but I'll briefly mention now, is that if you had 2010, 2011, and we were at the beginning of the 2010 budget year, the budget cycle which we've just finished in our last 2 sessions, we were staring at an $8.5 billion deficit. And later we'll talk about how the legislature passed a bill to address that. But I tell you that because this is not a short-term problem. with an $8.5 billion deficit for 2010 and 11, so more than $4 billion a year. You're looking at 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, and 2014, where you're averaging over $3 billion a year in deficit. This is a long-term problem that state of Connecticut and its legislature need to address. Let's go to the next slide. This next slide, again, just shows you where the money is spent. And I think oftentimes, you know, I was first elected in 1998, and one of the things that I heard when I was first running wasn't all that casino money supposed to go for our education, and where'd it go? And so oftentimes people have perceptions of where our money goes that don't necessarily meet with reality. So this is just a slide just to give you a background of where it goes. And I would just point to you to two areas. One is the largest slice of that pie, which is human services. And second is the yellow slice of the pie, which is our debt service. That 11% means that 11 cents of every dollar we spend goes to pay off interest on our debt. Doesn't go to pay for our roads, doesn't go to pay for health care, doesn't go to pay for social programs, doesn't go to pay for education. 11 cents of every dollar goes simply to pay off interest on our debt. I want to take a look at the next slide. This is a slide that shows you where our revenue comes from. And again, if you look at the three biggest slices, you see a third comes from the personal income tax, about 16% comes from the sales and use taxes, and 20% comes from the federal government. And that money there reflects the fact that we still only get about 67 cents back on the dollar that we send down to Washington. Why don't we go to the next slide? The next slide is probably not a surprise to anyone in this room because it's what we've all faced with this economic recession. Starting sometime between 2007 and 2008, you start to see our revenue to the state of Connecticut. Does that make it worse or better? We turn that off, thanks. You start to see a significant drop in revenue to the state of Connecticut. Over 100,000 jobs have been lost. The financial services industry, which has fueled our economy and our income tax growth, has taken a major hit. And that slide tells you how much less revenue we've seen and basically parallels the economic recession that we've seen. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide is what I had mentioned earlier. This was what happened when the state of Connecticut faced an $8.5 billion budget deficit. You know, and the reality is when this budget was passed, and it was a budget that for the first time in my 12 years was a purely partisan budget. In the prior 5 budgets that we worked on, Democrats, Republicans, and the legislature and the governor's office negotiated, sometimes easily, sometimes not so easily, but tried to negotiate a bipartisan budget. For the first time, and in the most difficult of times, we ended up with a partisan budget where Democrats voted yes, not all, and all Republicans voted no. This budget actually became law because Governor Rell chose not to sign it, which means you can either veto it or not, but if you don't sign it, it becomes law. And candidly, I'll tell you, I think that was a mistake on her part. But let me just show you how we balanced our budget with an $8.5 billion budget gap. We had $4.3 billion, or more than half of it, in one-time revenue. One-time revenue is money that you're going to get for 1 year, but you're not going to get it the next year. So we took $1.38 billion from the rainy day fund. We had $102.5 million in fund sweeps. That's essentially looking at all of state government agencies, finding out if they have any money left over at the end of the year, and taking that money. We had $60 million where we sold some state assets, excess land and the like, buildings perhaps. We got $1.47 billion in federal stimulus money. And the first one, which I didn't forget, is the $1.3 billion in borrowing. We had our state treasurer go out to the market, sell bonds, and to the tune of $1.3 billion that was used to cover the prior year's operating deficit. So that yellow slice I showed you, where 11 cents of every dollar we spend goes to pay interest. And those bonds were called short-term economic recovery notes. They weren't 20, 30-year bonds, they were shorter bonds. But that was to cover a shortfall for a year, which we will be paying for and taxpayers will be paying for the next 5 to 8 years. We also, the budget also included $1.47 billion in tax increases. It included $97.4 million in fee increases. It included $1 billion in unspecified saving targets. You might be wondering what that is. It's a great question because a lot of it was unspecified. A lot of it were assumptions that we can go save this amount of money. It included $630 million from state employee concessions. And I'll pause there to say that this was something that Governor Rell negotiated with state employees. State employees are currently operating under a contract that was signed under Governor Rowland's day till the year 2017. State employees were under no obligation to come forward and offer concessions, but to their credit and to the credit of Governor Rell, they sat down at a table, worked on some concessions, and saved the taxpayers $630 million. There was $4.6 million from agency mergers and $900 million in spending reductions. So my last comment on this slide is with $8.5 billion of a budget deficit, the budget that was passed cut spending by $900 million. Asked for concessions from state employees for $630 million. And the rest was all one-time revenue or tax increases. So when you look at the slide before and say, well, we have a $3 billion deficit for each of the next couple of years, the answer is because in our current budget, we didn't deal with the long-term structural project. We just dealt with the problem for that day and essentially kicked the real problem, that big budget deficit, down the road to future years. Why don't we take a look at the next slide? Okay. This next slide, and you might be wondering why are you showing that slide. Just gives you a flavor, since we are here in Fairfield County, and I think there is a tendency upon all of us in elected office who represent towns and cities in Fairfield County, Democrats and Republicans, that perhaps we don't exactly get as much attention from Hartford as we deserve. And it just shows you that essentially one county, or 895,000 residents out of about 3.4 million people, pay essentially half of the income taxes that come in the state of Connecticut. Get in return from Hartford, again, it's about 5 cents on the dollar if you live in Fairfield and about 2 cents on the dollar if you live in Westport.